Answers in Genesis and Cedarville College present Answers with Ken Ham, a 12-part video series defending the Bible from the very first verse. Today's question, do animals evolve? And now, Ken Ham.
I was a high school biology teacher for a number of years in the public schools in Australia, and my students used to ask some very interesting questions. I'll never forget the time that one particular young man came to me and he said, "Hey sir, how did Noah get all those animals on the ark?" And I said to him, "How many animals did he need to get on the ark?" "I don't know, sir, but it couldn't have happened." "Well, what size was the ark?" "I don't know, sir, but it couldn't have happened, could it?" You know, I always get worried about a student who can't fit an unknown number of animals in an unknown size boat. Tells you something about his grasp of mathematics, I guess. It's even worse when they come to you and say, "Hey sir, how did Moses get all them animals in the ark?" Then you realize they're really missing some information here. But you know, that's one of the questions that I get asked a lot. How did Noah get all the animals in the ark? In fact, the secular world often asks that question to say, see, if you don't have an answer, I'm not going to believe in Noah's ark. That couldn't have happened. It couldn't have been a real event. We need to be able to give answers to those sort of questions. And what I want to do in this particular session is to show you how we can develop an answer to that, and it also helps us explain many other things as well. So we're going to start with the Bible and build our thinking on the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, God tells us that He made the animals and plants after their kind. In fact, the phrase after its kind or after their kind occurs 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. It's as if God is saying He made distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind. Now here's where the evolutionists say, now we've got you Christians, because we know that animals change. Well, do animals change? Think about that for a moment. Because they say, look, animals change. And yet the Bible's saying God made distinct kinds of animals and plants. Well, let's delve into this a bit more. When I visited the Natural History Museum in London, it's very interesting. You walk past in one particular room a bust of Darwin, and here is their room dedicated to Darwinian evolution. And as you walk in, on the left there's a sign, and it says this: "Before Charles Darwin, most people believed that God created all living things in exactly the form that we see them today. This is the basis of the doctrine of creation." Stop right there for a moment. That's not true. I don't believe God created things exactly as we see them today. Take a poodle. There wasn't a poodle in the Garden of Eden. I mean, a poodle is a degenerate mutant mutt, isn't it? I mean, it has all sorts of mistakes. God didn't make a poodle. A poodle's a result of the curse more than anything. And yet it's a dog, right? It's a descendant of the original dog. But you see, they're setting up a straw man here. They're trying to say, see, creationists believe God made the world just as we see it today. No, the world has changed. It's changed in many ways. Because of sin, because of the curse. It's changed because of the flood. It's interesting, on the other side, they had a sign that said this: "Darwin's work supported the view that all living things have developed into the forms we see today by a process of gradual change over long periods of time. This is what is meant by evolution." Now, I want you to think about this. Change. Well, we ask the question, do dogs change? You know what the answer is? Yes, they do. They change into dogs, don't they? But there's all sorts of different varieties of dogs. In fact, we believe in those same sorts of changes that Darwin observed. As you walk into this Darwin exhibit, one of the first signs you see is this. It says, "When weasels breed together, they produce more weasels like themselves." Marvelous statement. And I totally agree with that statement. Weasels produce weasels. But what they were showing you was this. Look at all the changes in weasels, and then changes in dogs, and then changes in certain finches, and so on. And they say, there it is. There's the evidence for evolution. Huh? Did I miss something? See, think about the dog kind. You say, well, wait a minute. We've got wolves and coyotes, dingoes, etc. You know, Great Dane, Little Chihuahua, poodles, which are really a lesser dog, but nonetheless, they're still a dog. By the way, what were they? Dogs. What are they? Dogs. What will they be? Dogs. Incidentally, is that evolution? The answer is no. That's just what? Dogs. But how do we get all those different varieties of dogs? Well, if God made distinct kinds of animals and plants, He made the dog kind. Let's say there were 2 dogs to start with. We don't know how many dogs there were to start with, but let's say God made 2 dogs, and they get married and have kids, and their kids get married and have kids, and their kids get married and have kids, and you end up with lots of dogs. People say, okay, I can understand that. You've got lots of dogs, okay? But how then do you get these different varieties of dogs, like wolves and coyotes, dingo, collie, poodle, and so on? Well, you know that life is built up on the basis of information, that molecule of heredity, DNA. And dogs have dog genes, if you like. And you get one set of genes from the male and one from the female, and then you get your offspring produced. Remember how we learn at school about genes, not the genes you wear, you know the genes in your cells? millions of years ago for some of us, I think. But anyway, you remember how we learnt about pairs of genes like big A, big B, and its corresponding little b, big C, little c. Remember that? Well, of course, it's much, much more complicated than this, but the basic principles are still the same. And that's what we want to deal with. Just basic principles so we can understand this. Okay, imagine we have a male dog and a female dog. Big A, big B, little b, big C, little c. Look, let me give you an idea of how much information's in our genes. If you took just one man and one woman from this audience, do you know, if it were physically possible, you could actually have more children than atoms in the known universe without getting two looking the same? Isn't that an incredible amount of variability? Do you know how many atoms they estimate are in the known universe? 10 to the 80th power. That's a 1 followed by 80 zeros. Do you know how many possible combinations of children from two people without getting two exactly the same? It's been estimated to be a 10 to the 2017th power. That's a 1 followed by 2017 zeros. That's a lot of information, isn't it? And we could say that God put that same sort of variability into dogs and into cats and into elephants and so on. That's why, look around the world, billions of people, yet we're all basically a little different, aren't we? Think about it. And each one of you has a unique combination of information. You know, some of you have information for black hair, some for brown hair, some don't look like you got information for hair. Actually, you do. It's just you're sort of more like poodles, if you know what I mean. But anyway, we'll talk about that later on. But you see, imagine we've got this male dog and female dog, and we know that in the male, the sperm is produced, the gametes produced with half the number of chromosomes. In the female, you get the egg produced and so on. And so you can imagine from the male, we could get big A, big B, big C, and from the female, big A, big B, big C. So you get an individual, fertilization. 2 big A's, 2 big B's, 2 big C's. And then you could get some other individuals, 2 little A's, 2 little B's, 2 little C's. In other words, you could get different combinations from the parents, and there are millions and millions of possible combinations. They're all going to be dogs. They're all going to be a little different, but they're all still 100% what? Dog. Exactly. So we get all this variation within the dog kind. You say, okay, it's sort of like looking around this room here. We see we're all humans, all a little different, but we're still 100% what? Human. Okay? Now, you say, all right, I can understand that, but how do we get such different varieties as wolves and dingoes, coyotes, and so on? Well, let me explain it this way. Let's use our biblical glasses. We're going to put in our biblical glasses, okay, like we talked about in other lectures. We're going to look at the world through our biblical glasses, and we're going to go into the Bible and look at biblical history. We're going to consider the event of Noah's Ark, Noah's flood. God sent 2 of every kind of land animal, 7 of some, on board Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark landed in the Middle East. So Noah's Ark must have had 2 dogs. It had 2 of all the unclean kind, so 2 dogs are on Noah's Ark. So 2 dogs get off Noah's Ark, and they get married and have kids, and their kids get married and have kids, and their kids married and have kids, and you end up with lots of dogs again. Okay, but this time, we've got a world that's basically empty, and all sorts of different environments, because now things have run down, the flood has destroyed the earth and so on, so there's all sorts of different environments. And we know in biology that there are some things that can happen that can cause what we would call rapid speciation. If you take a large population and you just take a small population from that large population and take it off on its own and isolate it, maybe even just a pregnant female to start a new population, then they're called a founder population. Now, understanding the founder principle and things like genetic drift and jumping genes, you don't have to worry about all that, but it's things that happen in genetics. What can happen is that genes can be easily lost from a population. Genes that normally don't show up so much in a population can be exhibited in a population very quickly. In other words, you could actually get quite rapid speciation. In fact, think about this. Think about dogs getting off Noah's Ark and a small population breaking off and moving in one direction, and another small population breaking off and moving in a different direction. And as a small population moves towards, say, a cold climate, those that happen to have the genes for long hair to survive a cold climate survive better than those that have genes for short hair, and so eventually you only get long-haired dogs. And the opposite in a hot climate. In other words, if we have L representing long-haired genes, S representing short-haired genes, imagine that medium-furred dogs get off Noah's Ark, all right? And only those with the L genes eventually survive. In a cold climate, all those with the S genes die out. You'll produce a different variety, but it's still a dog, and it no longer has the information for short hair. The opposite could happen as it goes down to a hot climate. And you can see over a period of time what that can lead to, a formation of different varieties, different species. For instance, in dogs, you can end up with wolves and dingoes, coyotes, and so on. It's very, very easy to understand. We call that process when animals are selected for because of the environment, we call that natural selection. And Darwin talked about natural selection, didn't he? Well, natural selection is what you observe. You know, some Christians think natural selection is the same as evolution. No, it's not. Natural selection is what you observe in the present world. The selection process for the characteristics animals have to enable them to survive in a particular environment depends upon the environment and the genes that they have. But that is not evolution. In fact, I'm going to say to you that really the processes that are occurring here are, in essence, the opposite of evolution. You know the interesting thing? The interesting thing is, when I was a biology teacher, and still today I find in the public schools, they teach this as a part of the mechanism for evolution. But wait a minute. What is happening as you split up those populations and as animals die out and so on? You're losing information. You see, over a period of time, natural selection results in loss of information, specialization. You can even get to the stage where they can't interbreed anymore. And I've heard teachers say, see, that's evolution. If that's evolution, you're worse off because now you can't even regain the information that you had. Because now they can't even mix together anymore to regain all that original variability that they had. And see, the other thing to remember is, too, from our observations in the real world, Dr. Werner Gitt from Germany, in his book, In the Beginning Was Information, said this: there is no known law of nature, no known process, no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. In other words, matter never gives rise to information. See, think about this. If you're going to change fish eventually into birds, okay, because evolutionists say fish into amphibians and reptiles, reptiles into birds and mammals, and finally ape-like creatures, and then finally man. Think about fish and then think about birds. Fish don't have feathers, right? Birds have feathers. When you consider that, you say, well, somewhere information for feathers had to come into existence. Where's information for feathers going to come from? Well, Dr. Werner Gitt says information never comes from matter by itself. Matter doesn't generate information. Information comes from information, ultimately from an intelligence. And so you see, right there, evolution has a major, major problem. But of course, you know what they teach in the public school textbooks? Mutations. Who's heard of mutations? You all heard of mutations? Yeah. Well, poodles are mutations. But mutations can be copying mistakes when reproduction occurs, copying mistakes in our DNA, the genes. It can be due to X-rays and things like that causing mistakes. Dr. Lee Spetner, a fellow from Johns Hopkins University, in his book Not by Chance, said this: all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. Then he goes on and says this: not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. Do you realize what this scientist is saying? In all of his observations, mutations result in loss of information. They reduce information. They do not cause a gain of new information. Now, for evolution to occur, you've got to have new information being added into the system. In other words, so far, everything we observe in real science in the present goes against the idea of molecules to man evolution. But you know what the teachers say or professors say? I've had students come to me and say this. They say, but wait a minute, Mr. Ham, our professor said there is an example of new information arising by itself. For instance, insects become resistant to poisons, and bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. Who's heard those particular examples? I'm sure many of us have. You know what? We need to have answers to those sorts of things. In fact, as we're teaching in our churches, you know, this is the sort of thing we need to be teaching in our churches at a level that students can understand. Because one of the sad things, often in our churches, we just teach the Bible and we don't connect the Bible to the real world. And so our children go out into the real world, and the real world says, we teach science, and that's got nothing to do with the Bible. And in our churches, we teach Bible and think that's got nothing to do with science. So the world has separated God from science, and we in our churches tend to separate science from God. We've got to be able to teach our children to show them that we can use the Bible to make sense of the world, connect the Bible to the real world, and we've got answers for these questions that people bring up. And so when we teach them that God made distinct kinds of animals and plants, we can talk about natural selection or we can talk about mutations, and then we need to give them answers to these sorts of accusations as well. You can't be right because bacteria become resistant to antibiotics, insects become resistant to poisons. Let me give you just a little insight here. With insects, back in 1978, Francisco Ayala wrote an article in Scientific American, and the situation, I believe, has not changed since then, talking about insect resistance. And what he's saying here is this: the genetic variants required for resistance to the most diverse kinds of pesticides were apparently present in every one of the populations exposed to these man-made compounds. In other words, insect resistance is an inherited resistance. It'd be like as if you were all mosquitoes in a swamp and we sprayed you with DDT. And some of you survived. Why? You happen to have the right variation of information in your genes to be resistant to that particular poison. The rest of you died out. And so now you have offspring, and they inherit that resistance from you. So it's not that they become resistant, you've just eliminated the non-resistant ones, right? That's not an example of evolution. In fact, again, you're losing information. You're losing genetic material from a population. What about bacteria? Well, the same sort of thing can happen with bacteria. For instance, there was a historic Franklin expedition, which occurred about 150 years ago, and people died in the Arctic, and they were frozen, actually, and when they recovered their bodies, many, many years later, over a century later, they were able to revive some bacteria from their bodies, and they found that they were already resistant to antibiotics that were invented long after the time they perished. Right? So they already had that inherited resistance. But sometimes it is true, antibiotics can become, bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics, a resistance they previously didn't have. But again, it's due to a loss of information. It's due to a problem. For instance, some bacteria get a mutation so they can't transport materials across their cell wall as well as they could, and so the antibiotic can't be taken across the cell wall, so it won't kill the bacteria, but that's because it now can't do something it previously could. That's how it gained a resistance. Or it might be that it produces an enzyme that breaks down an antibiotic into poisons to destroy the DNA, but if it has a mutation that stops it producing that enzyme, like one of the bacteria that they believe, the bacterium they believe forms stomach ulcers, this can happen. If it gets a mutation and stops it producing the enzyme, then it becomes resistant because it no longer breaks down the antibiotic to form poisons. Or in another instance, it can cause an overproduction of an enzyme to enable it to become resistant, but then it's using valuable resources and actually overall is weaker. There are many, many other examples we could talk about, but they have nothing to do with an increase in information. A reduction of information, but not an increase in information. You know the reason we have mutations in the first place, mistakes occurring, is because of the curse, because sin and the curse. And you know, when you think about it with dogs, when mutations occur, normally in the wild, through processes like natural selection, most of those mutations would be lost from the population because they wouldn't survive as well. But you see, what we do artificial selection. You know, we look at dogs and say, oh, look at this dog, mean little dog here, and this mean little dog, and you breed them together, try and get a poodle or something like that. Or you say, wow, look at this dog here, has his jaw stuffed up into its face and its nose stuffed up into its face, and eventually you breed the bulldog. And I mean, let's face it, in the wild, the bulldog wouldn't survive very well, would it? You know, if you think about it, take a poodle. You ever seen all the mistakes that are in a poodle? I mean, these are just some of the mistakes in a poodle. Why would you want a dog like that? Actually, if you think about it, the domestic dogs like the poodle, I mean, it costs you millions of dollars to keep them alive, doesn't it? You've got to take them to the vet every now and then. You've got to give them heartworm tablets every month. If they get a cold, you lay awake all night wondering if they'll be dead in the morning. If you take them outside on their own, they can't find their way back home. But you know, the mongrel dog down the street, I mean, you know, it's a mixture of everything. I mean, you can run over those things in a truck and they get up and wave and off they go. You know, there's something dreadfully wrong with all those mutations in our domestic varieties. But see, we keep them alive. Normally they wouldn't stay alive out there in the wild. We deliberately keep them alive. And so through artificial selection, we're able to get our various domestic breeds, including poodles. By the way, what this all helps us understand here is this. When you think about it, Noah didn't need to take on the ark dingoes and wolves and coyotes and Great Dane and little chihuahua. He just needed 2 dogs, didn't he? That's all he needed, 2 dogs. With cats, we're not sure how many cat kinds. If I'd have been on the ark, there'd be no cat kinds. They would have been overboard, but it's because I don't like cats, I guess. But anyway, sorry about that. I know you've probably all got cats. But with cats, some people suggest there might only be 1 cat kind, but maybe 2, maybe 3 cat kinds. But see, not hundreds of cat kinds. With elephants, probably just 1 kind of elephant. You know, your mammoths, your Indian elephants, your stegodons, stegomastodons, African elephants, probably all came from just 2 elephants on Noah's Ark. That's very, very easy to understand when you understand some basic biology here. And so when you think about it, Noah didn't need near the number of animals we think on the ark. In fact, one of our researchers associated with the Creation Ministry, John Woodmarampe, has a book called Noah's Ark, a Feasibility Study, and in there he does a lot of research concerning kinds and the number of animals on the ark, and he comes to the conclusion probably less than 16,000 animals, fewer than 16,000 animals needed on the ark. That would have filled probably less than a third of the ark. There was plenty of room. In fact, I often say to people, there was plenty of room on the ark for people. And they were out there when Noah was preaching, come into the ark to be saved, there's plenty of room. And sadly, only 8 people were saved on that boat. You know, one of the sad things I find in the Christian world is a man called Dr. Hugh Ross, who is a progressive creationist. He believes in billions of years, believes in Big Bang, believes in a local flood. Because he believes in millions of years, he can't believe in a global flood. You see, because I believe most of your fossils came from the flood of Noah's day, and some came after the flood. But if you believe in millions of years, you can't believe in a global flood because it would have ripped up all those fossil layers and redeposited them. So if you believe in millions of years, to be consistent, like Dr. Hugh Ross, you've got to believe in a local flood. Because he believes in a local flood, therefore, he can't have creationists like myself explaining all the species, varieties of animals over the earth from those that were on board Noah's Ark. And so he actually accuses us in his books of believing in evolution because we believe in speciation. But I want you to understand that speciation has nothing to do with the idea of molecules to man evolution. When you understand some basic biology, this really is easy to understand. And you know, when you do understand speciation, you do understand natural selection, when you do understand the processes of genetics, it helps us in explaining something else as well. You see, the Bible tells us that all human beings go back to 2 people, Adam and Eve. Just 2 people. In fact, that's very, very important. You see, the Bible explains to us, really, that there's only one race of human beings. Now, a lot of people today think there are lots of different races, because look around the world and you see all these different people and they seem to be very, very different. We're going to discuss that in another program. But I've had people say to me, now wait a minute, aren't there different races of people? I mean, how do the different races of people come about? We can only go back to one man and one woman. I know of Bible colleges that have taught that there was a race of men and a race of women to start with, because they say, how else can you explain, you know, the different people groups that we have around the earth? Well, I hope you can start to think ahead here just a little bit and think in terms of the processes we've talked about in regard to genetics and in regard to natural selection and so on, to get an idea of how we might begin to explain the different people groups if they all go back to one man and one woman. And incidentally, you know why it's important that we understand we go back to one man? Only descendants of that one man, Adam, can be saved. Think about that. Only descendants of Adam can be saved, because Jesus Christ became a descendant of Adam. He's called the last Adam. He died for the descendants of Adam. He became one of us, of our blood. So it's only descendants of Adam can be saved. So therefore, it's important to explain that we all go back to Adam and Eve. Now, just to give you a little way of thinking here, to jump ahead, how do we form our different varieties of dogs? Well, you take a population, you have to split them up, to get different combinations of information in separate groups. Now, can you think of any way that the humankind, the human race, might have been split up so that you could get different combinations of information in separate groups, and yet we're all still the one race, we're all still the one kind? Does anyone have an idea? The Tower of Babel. Exactly. Now, start to think that through, and we'll do that in more detail in a future program. You know, it's very, very important to understand these things, because, you see, when we start with the Bible and put in our biblical glasses, and we start with the Bible as a history book, because that's what I call the Bible, the history book of the universe. And when we put on our biblical glasses and look at the world, it makes a big difference if you consider that all human beings are related and we all go back to one man. Doesn't that make a big difference? Because that means we're all equal, doesn't it? But you see, if you believe in the evolutionary view, and you believe that one kind of animal changed into another, ape-like creatures turned into people, and therefore some humans were closer to apes than others, you could understand how people might look down on some particular people groups because they were considered, well, they're closer to the apes than others, and you could understand how racist attitudes could develop. And you know, that's exactly what's happened in our world. And we're going to talk about that too. You see, when you start with the Bible, the foundation of God's Word, then we have an understanding there's one race of people. just one race. We all go back to Adam and Eve. We understand those other things that we've talked about in the other programs. We understand the basis for right and wrong. We understand the difference between good and evil. We understand that marriage is one man for one woman for life, and so on. But if you start from an evolutionary foundation, that man is just an animal, evolved over millions of years and so on, then there are different races of people. And you see, evolution inherently is a racist philosophy. And so some are closer to the apes than others, and it has caused people to look down on certain people and to treat them in the wrong way. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that there was no racism before evolution. There have always been racist attitudes when people do not build their thinking on the Bible. And we need to make sure that we build our thinking on the Bible so that we develop a Christian worldview and then look at the world through our biblical glasses. And that's what we're going to do in some other programs here. We're going to be looking at the world through our biblical glasses so that we have the right understanding of who we are, the right understanding of our fellow man. In fact, think about this. Think about the application. Why do we take the gospel message to tribes and nations all around the world? Why does God tell us to go out and preach the gospel to every tribe and nation? You know why? Because we're all related, because we're all descendants of Adam, because we all go back to Adam and Eve. But what we need to do is to explain, well, how come you've got people who are Chinese and people with black skin and people with middle brown skin and people with light skin and how come you've got people who've got almond eye shape and so on? How to explain that? It's very, very simple. And we're going to do that in a future program. I'd really recommend to you Dr. Gary Parker's book, Creation, The Facts of Life. He also deals with this issue of natural selection. He's a professor in biology, a professor at a Christian college, and he deals with biology from a creationist perspective. And he used to be an ardent evolutionist, so he knows how evolutionists think. And so he's able to explain these things to you so you can defend the Christian faith. Thank you very much.
For more information on Answers in Genesis, call toll-free 1-800-350-3232 or visit our website, answersingenesis.org. This video series was produced on the campus of Cedarville College, a creationist Baptist college of arts, sciences, and professional programs. For more information, call toll-free 1-800-CEDARVILLE or visit the college website, cedarville.edu.